So welcome all. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine is continuing, and I'm joined now by CivilNet host and analyst Eric Hacopian to unpack the latest developments. So Eric, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
The first question is that the Western nations have moved to kick Russia out of the SWIFT system. What is the SWIFT system, if you can explain to our watchers, and what was your reaction to this news?
Well, the SWIFT system is essentially it's the primary system the World Bank, banks around the world use to transfer money. Mm-hmm. Essentially, SWIFT is a third party that, will take money from Citibank in New York and take it to a bank in Zurich. So it's essentially a vehicle that's used for almost all international transactions. And there's the only precedent for any country being taken off of SWIFT, as far as I know, in the recent times was Iran. Russia is the second one, even though these are far more limited in the sense that they only cover, I think, 20 entities in the two primary banks, but they don't cover all other transactions. So this is what led to the drop in the ruble yesterday. I think it dropped by, depending on the time of the day, 20 to 25%, which is significant in a day. And it also forced the Russian central bank to increase interest rates by 10 points, which is unprecedented, to protect the value of the ruble. As far as using SWIFT as a weapon of enforcing international law, well, I mean, if the object is to punish serious breaches of international law, in this case, aggression and genocide are the two highest forms of egregious lines that you don't cross in international law. It's, the Russian action, it warrants it. However, if you use the same standard, you should come back the next day and consider doing the same thing with the Chinese regime based on its treatment of the Uyghurs. And the following day, you should come back and look at the UAE and Saudi Arabia for what they're doing in Yemen. According to the UN, there's about 5 million people that are starving to death in Yemen right now, and there's another 9 million that are on the verge of joining them. And obviously, you can go to our neighbor Turkey, that's invaded 3 of its neighbors and done ethnic cleansing in 2 places, in northern Iraq and Syria and in Artsakh. So I'm all for using these standards. However, if the standards are simply for countries that you don't like and they don't apply to the countries that you do like, then they're simply not standards, they're just hypocrisies.
In terms of the PR war, the battle of narratives, Ukraine seems to be winning. What do you think of that when you're observing these narratives? Is that going to tip the odds in Ukraine's favor? And for our watchers, can you explain what we mean when we say the PR war?
The PR war is essentially, the stories that come out of everything from the most mundane, this house got bombed, this civilian got killed, to this soldier did this heroic thing, anything that involves in shaping a narrative or weaving a narrative about the war. And this is not, if this was the war itself, the Ukrainians would be outside of the Kremlin, because this is, what they're doing is avant-garde. I mean, it's cutting-edge stuff, and it's very well done. They're telling a much, much better narrative. Now, granted, they have the easier side of it because they're the ones who are being invaded, so it's a much easier case to make. However, they're doing a masterful job, and we've seen with some of the fabrications, for example, as far as those people on the island that were never killed and actually surrendered. They made a big story out of that. And this ghost of Kiev that never existed, that supposedly shot down 6 Russian planes, but it ended up being a video game. So you see this, but I have to tell you, this is so well done. And it's also so very American, I would say Anglo-Saxon. And having worked in the public relations political field in the United States, I can just tell you this is probably not being done by Ukrainians. It's probably done by Western actors or Western state actors because they understand every button to push. And the narrative that they're putting out is they know exactly how to not just talk to a Western audience, but a modern audience. And a modern audience is essentially everyone under 40 around the world. So they've managed to make Ukraine the cost celeb of, people who don't know nothing about this region or nothing about this conflict.
And how is the war actually going militarily? On the Ukrainian side, the narrative is that Russia was expecting to really blitzkrieg through Ukraine, but hasn't managed to. But on the Russian side, they are talking about military advances in a lot of different regions of Ukraine. So what do you think about how the actual war is going militarily?
Well, they're both right. I think it's clear that the Ukrainians are putting up a much tougher fight than anyone expected. However, so did our guys in Artsakh 2 years ago. But that doesn't fundamentally change the power dynamics here. The Russians are making very slow and steady advances. And to put things in perspective, this is sort of a, it took the Americans 3 weeks to get to Baghdad, and there was almost no resistance. The Russians were outside of Kiev in a day and a half. And I think they made a foolhardy attempt to try to see if they can end it quickly by having special forces going into the city, which was a disaster. But I think people have this war is, the PR war at the end of the day doesn't move lines and doesn't involve tanks. So the Ukrainians can win the entire narrative of war. But if you look at it, they're slowly and steadily losing ground. I heard this morning that Mariupol has been surrounded this morning, and if that happens, then essentially the Russians have cut them off. Almost, most of the southern Ukrainian coastline to the Black Sea would be closed outside of the area around Odessa. So, and in the north, they're slowly, making their way into the big cities, Kharkov, Kiev. They're surrounding them. And there looks to be a pincer movement from north to south to essentially trap Ukrainian troops, which are essentially facing the Donbass. The best of the Ukrainian troops are actually on the eastern front, against in front of the Donbass. And if they actually get encircled, that's going to entrap 40,000 of their best troops. So I think there's a tendency to forget, to miss the forest from the trees. This obviously has been far more costly to the Russians than they ever expected. However, they are making progress, and it's one side that's pretty much retreating every single day on the map, and I frankly don't see that reversing itself. And lastly, Russians had not even committed most of their troops, in the first couple of days of the war. And in most instances, the attacking side needs to have 3 times more troops than the opposing side, which was not the case. And they're actually bringing in more and more people. So essentially, the Russian attackers were fighting larger number of defenders, which is not how you necessarily win this war. I think whatever the fantasies the Russians had about this becoming whatever they did in the Donbass in 2014, I'm not in Donbass, in the Crimea. That's certainly not the case. However, the Ukrainians are, when it comes to the battlefield, are slowly losing the war.
And the economic war too has started. A whole slew of economic sanctions have been imposed on Russia. This will also have economic consequences for the West and even Armenia. So what do you think will be the real world ramifications of these sanctions?
Well, the ramifications of this economic war, frankly, are in some ways far more relevant to the world than this actual war, because Russia, in and of itself, is an integral part of the world economy. It's an integral part of the European economy. For example, if you look at the sanctions that have actually been put on Russia, outside of the sanctions on the central bank, given the fact that they are not sanctioning the energy sector, which Russia gets most of its income from, because they can't sanction it, because then Germans and Danes and whoever else is buying Russian gas can't pay them, and so the Russians will cut it off. So I think the economic bite people in a couple of days will adjust themselves to figure out that this is not what happened to Iran, and you see that. Listen, the ruble fell by 20-25%. However, similar sanctions were put on Iran. The rial fell 200-300% in a couple of days. So there's a question of scale here, and there's only so much you can sanction. However, the more frightening things here is the issues of food security. Ukraine and Russia are the breadbaskets of most of this region, including North Africa and the Middle East. And if the shipments are interrupted, if anything happens on that front, you're looking at raising bread prices 3 or 4 times, 300-400%. And if that happens, you're destabilizing a whole bunch of countries, from Turkey to Egypt to Lebanon, and just on really odd things like fertilizer. Russia is one of the biggest fertilizer producers in the world at a time when there's great demands for it. So I think this is obviously the most critical one, being the oil prices. If oil prices, continue to rise, we're almost certainly walking into another recession. And even some ordinary thing, not even ordinary things, but if you look at if all these countries are closing their airspace to Russia. However, if Russia, for example, closes its airspace, as it has to European countries, to the U.S. carriers, pretty much every flight from North America to Asia needs to be rerouted, because every flight that goes to China, Korea, Thailand, Singapore, they all go through Russia. And if they need to be rerouted, you essentially need to either go to Alaska and refuel, or you go to South America and refuel, which will make every trip 10 hours longer and twice as expensive. So I don't think people understand the domino effect of disasters that are coming, that are coming from this. And they're not all one-sided. You can punish the hell out of Iran and have little consequences. If you look at the map, Russia is nearly, hell. It looks like it's half the world. It isn't, but for practical purposes, as far as the affluent parts of the world, it is half the world.
And I'm also interested what you think about the Armenian reactions to this war. Some have been very sympathetic, especially having seen a war in 2020. Others claim that Ukraine is more or less a pro-Azerbaijan country. I mean, it's really a plethora of opinions. Others say that the world didn't pay attention to the Second Karabakh War, and that is a point of contention. So what do you think of the various Armenian reactions? What do you think when you see Armenians reacting to the invasion?
I think the reactions here are very much like around the world, but with a very specific local angle that makes the Ukrainian state far less one that people would sympathize with. Obviously, I think there's great sympathy for what Ukrainian civilians are going through. I don't think there's any question about that. In fact, as you know, the Armenian government even offered to take Ukrainian refugees. So I think when it comes to what's going on to the people there, there's obviously great sympathy. There's not great sympathy for Zelensky or the Ukrainian state. So there's no great love for, and Zelensky, was very pro-Azeri, very pro-Turkish, and when in the case of the war, if you're those two things, you're distinctly anti-Armenian. So there's no great sympathy for the Ukrainian state or for Zelensky himself. But then you have the gamut of opinions. The people who are not pro-Russia or pro-EU tend to be pro-Ukraine, and you have the other side who are saying, the hell with this. Why should we care? And there's obviously the issue of no one came to our aid, and the whole world is mobilizing for Ukraine, which is a fair point. However, it's never a healthy thing to get into this, who had it worst type of arguments. But fundamentally, yes, they cared far less about us than they cared about Ukrainians for reasons that are quite sometimes obvious and sometimes quite complicated. But so the reaction is different. Again, sympathetic to people, but certainly not sympathetic to a state who is playing itself off as some democratic beacon when it essentially armed two fascist states to do what it's being done to it right now.
And what do you think this war is really about?
A whole bunch of misunderstandings and misconceptions of what's important in the world. I mean, if you look around, frankly, this is very frustrating. This is just the greatest collection of people who are clueless running the world since, what the people who brought us World War I. Let's take the Russian side. Ukraine is a dysfunctional country. It was essentially Argentina in the middle of Europe. It was it's a large country that produced wheat, and it was entirely dysfunctional. In fact, I think it's the only post-Soviet country that hasn't hit 1990 GDP levels, which is amazing. And it's not a threat to anyone. And if you know anything about Western Europe, most European countries aren't willing to defend themselves, much less attack anybody else, even though I totally understand the whole understanding of not having NATO at your borders or having Ukraine be NATO. I think I totally understand that. But the greatest geopolitical threat to Russia is not coming from the West. It's actually, they have to look south. There are, to the south of them, in between Armenia and China, there are 7, current and future Afghanistans, current and future failed states. In fact, literally, if you take out the carbon industries out of the GDPs of almost all of these countries, the ones that do have carbon resources, their GDP level is on with Afghanistan, somewhere in the $700-800 a year range. And these countries are going to collapse and implode over the next 20 years as this war actually makes decarbonization even faster, which is what's going to be one of the effects of this war, because Western Europe is going to figure we have to move to renewables much quicker. That is the greatest threat to Russian long-term national security, is having 7 Afghanistans to the side of you, with flat borders in which millions of people are going to try to walk to your country. From the Western side, this is utter insanity. When you hear people, former generals from NATO or members of the U.S. Senate or Congress talking about no-fly zones over Ukraine, you're talking about war between 2 nuclear powers if that happens. And that's just insane over this dysfunctional country. Whoever wins this war will regret winning, because it can't be made into a functional country, given many different reasons, economic and just demographic. And then you see, and what's really disturbing is this is part of this whole attitude about, hate Russians all you want, but there's a lot of people who are willing to fight, every last Russian with every last Ukrainian. Something they will never want to have any part of. And the most likely scenario here is that Ukraine loses. And if this war continues, what we're going to have is Ukraine is going to go from becoming the Argentina of Europe to becoming the Syria of Europe, with 6-7 million refugees finding their way around Europe. And these people are never coming back. Once you go from the poorest country in Europe to Holland or Germany, you're not coming back. So I think people are very flippant about very serious things and the consequences of it. We don't need, I was really today there's speculation that the Polish military is saying they can use our air bases to fly into Ukraine and out. Well, what if one day the Russians decide to destroy your base? Then you have war between NATO and Russia. And none of this is worth it. We don't need more weapons being shipped to this area. What we need is a ceasefire, and what we need is direct negotiations in which the Russians understand, no, Ukraine is going to stay independent. It's going to be its own country, and you need to withdraw, while essentially making Ukraine a neutral country that is not going to become part of NATO. This whole notion that yes, Ukraine, this right of Ukraine to associate with whoever, that right exists, but I have the right to be a center forward at the Premier League, but it's not going to happen. So it's not a question of what your rights are. It's a question of what price is it worth paying for that. So I'm just confounded and disappointed, and we could be sleepwalking ourselves into a nuclear war, a confrontation, because there's not right now today. There should be shuttle diplomacy. Blinken, Macron, all these people, and people criticize Macron for talking to the other side. Well, how are you going to end this conflict unless you talk? What we need is active diplomacy to end this war and come up with a solution that saves face for everyone, because the Ukrainians made their point, which, we're independent. And one thing that this war has done is created this Ukrainian identity as a state, which in some ways they didn't have before, and a narrative and a story. And the Russians have made their point that, they'll blow up the world if Ukraine joins NATO. Okay, we got the point. So this is what's needed is active diplomacy rather than egging people on. And that's what it seems like. People are almost eager for this war to go on, for there to be a siege of Kiev. I mean, really? Is that what we need? So I'm just confounded by the lack of leadership and just the utter irresponsibility of the things that people are saying and proposing.
And finally, briefly, some want Armenia to take a more pro-Ukraine approach. Others want Armenia to take a more pro-Russia approach. But for once, there is a general approval of the Armenian government's decision to kind of take this with a radio silence. Do you agree? Should they continue?
Absolutely. And what choice do they have? It's the only track to take. You don't want to approve of the Russian action, but given our security needs, you can't condemn it. And I think everybody understands that the limitations that we have. So I think they've done the right thing, even though I don't think there was any other option, to be honest with you. But they haven't done anything foolish. And if you notice, even the Georgian government, despite its popular support in the streets for Ukraine, is taking a very neutral approach here. So I think this is our choices are limited, and frankly, wars and conflict like this limit our choices in other countries like ours. The choices get constantly more limited.
Well, Eric, thank you as always.
Thank you.
And continue following CivilNet.